Welcome back to Inside Politics. Our guest today, Dr. John Weil from Middle Tennessee State University. We're talking about his book on the Declaration of Independence. Dr. Weil, Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence these immortal words: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." That would seem to be the ultimate American creed, but it didn't apply at that time to women. It didn't apply to African Americans. It didn't apply to Native Americans. It would seem those words have become not only our greatest aspiration, but our greatest challenge over the last 245 years.
I think that's right. And one of the fascinating things about American history is there have been many times the abolitionist movement, the women's rights movement, civil rights movement in the 1960s, particularly Dr. King's speeches where, he says it's time to claim the promise that we were given in the Declaration of Independence.
When it was debated by the Continental Congress, did the Southern delegates, who obviously were not happy about it, saying all men are created equal for fear that might get rid of slavery or get rid of the slave trade, did they try to think to change that language or modify it, take it out?
Not to my knowledge. Now, there was debate. Mr. Jefferson had a very long paragraph indicting the king for encouraging slavery and then encouraging slave revolts. And there's a portion of that that remains, but most of it was taken out. And there were some fears among Southerners that language like this might get out of hand. If African Americans began thinking that they had a right to revolution, we could be in trouble.
The Declaration was proclaimed at a very difficult time for the colonists. The war was going badly for General George Washington. It was going to get worse in the days right after that. If the modern day media had been reporting on what happened with the Declaration of Independence, might it have said that the Declaration appeared to be a last act of defiance?
It's possible. No one knew the outcome for sure. One of the geniuses of Washington, who had not much formal experience or training as a general, is that he realized that when you're fighting a defensive war and when someone is sending troops your way and you're on your home soil, that if you can last a long time, you're probably going to prevail. And of course, one of the hopes, which turned out to be true, was that the Declaration itself would be a stimulus to gaining foreign allies, particularly France.
The Declaration at its end says those who signed the document, quote, pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. That document did wind up having some dire consequences for some of the signees.
It did. I was looking on the net, it has something on the destiny of the signers, and they mentioned that a lot of them lost their property. A couple of them were captured. Many of them, or a fair number of them, lost sons in the Revolution or lost their homes. Notoriously, Thomas Nelson of Virginia at Yorktown actually encouraged the troops to fire on his house, which the British were using at the time. So a lot of them did make some substantial sacrifices.
When you look at the Declaration, the first thing that may stand out to you is the signature at the bottom. It is much larger than the others. Tell us about who that signature is and why he made it so big.
Well, it's by John Hancock, who of course was president of the Second Continental Congress. The myth, and I think if you compare it to other signatures, you'll find it's fairly standard for John Hancock. But the story is that he made it big. He made it so big so George III wouldn't have any trouble, reading the name. It makes a good story.
The two other people, we've mentioned them both before, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, were very much involved in drafting the Declaration. They were great friends at the time, but they later became rivals, then enemies, particularly after Jefferson defeated Adams for re-election in 1800. They did reconcile late in life, and they both share something very important about the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1826.
Yeah, they both died on that day, and if I can add, I have a book called A Constellation of Great Men, which talks about one of the people who attended the Second Continental Congress was Benjamin Rush, who was a doctor in Philadelphia. And he wrote a series of sketches on the people who had signed the document, including Adams and Jefferson. And in the early 1800s, when they fell out over party politics, he remained somehow friends with both. And he was the one who encouraged them to resume their correspondence. And of course, they both ended, was very productive. But they both ended up dying on July 4th of 1826. And by the way, James Monroe, 5 years later, also died on that day.
In your book, you detail the impact of the Declaration of Independence on our American art, our music, and our literature. Can you give us perhaps the best example of the impact that it had?
Well, one would be if you go to the U.S. Capitol, hopefully without breaking through the windows. But if you go there in the main dome, you'll see that one of the paintings, the Trumbull painting, is a painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Now, historically, it's not quite accurate because it was not signed on a single day. It was signed over a period of months. But it had, you can see most of the central characters who participated in that event.
In your book, you mentioned that President Abraham Lincoln once described the Declaration of Independence as the apple of gold around a frame of silver. What did he mean when he said that?
Well, this is very fascinating. Basically, he believed that the principle of equality, all men are created equal, he believed that that was a central credo of American democracy. And he believed that the Constitution was, when others were saying this was a slave document, he said, no, its ultimate desire was that of facilitating human freedom. The Constitution did not intend for slavery to continue forever. But what's interesting is when secession came along, Lincoln is citing all men are created equal, and the Southerners are saying, well, just like Americans had the right to secede from Britons, Southerners had the right to secede from Northerners.
Dr. John Viles, our guest on Inside Politics. He's a Middle Tennessee State University political science professor. He's also written a book on the Declaration of Independence. Back for more about his book after this break.